Hello there, good evening and welcome. Joining us on this special exclusive interview with News First, it's the UN's Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Mr. Tomoya Obokata. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your time. We know that you're having a very hectic schedule.
My pleasure.
Mr. Tomoya, let's start by talking about forced labor in Sri Lanka. How has the COVID-19 pandemic played a role in terms of that?
Children, because of lockdown measures, they were out of school. So what happens? I've heard cases of them working for parents, and often parents are also because they also lost their job, no other means. So oftentimes they are sending their children to work, and or these parents who lost their jobs are engaged in other type of work, very dangerous work like domestic work or sometimes like sex work for women. And I've heard all these disturbing stories from different organizations and also workers themselves.
In your findings, in your preliminary findings at the press briefing today, you spoke about how microfinance has affected Sri Lanka's women. Sri Lanka has had laws on microfinance since 2016. Do you feel that those laws are insufficient? What can Sri Lanka do more to improve?
I don't think it is, unfortunately, because if they are effective, then none of all of these really bad companies should have been prosecuted and punished. So there must be something there. Whether I've heard a story of these microfinance companies working with different kind of sectors of society, so that makes it difficult. I think I'm not saying that there's a corruption between that and police or anything like that, but still it's difficult. At the end of the day, police is not going to do anything because if you sign an agreement and that's it. And the police can come around and say, well, you signed this, so there's nothing we can do. So I've heard that happens under certain circumstances. So I don't think the law is enforced sufficiently.
Do you think it's a case of Sri Lankan authorities not creating enough awareness among women so that they're sort of duped into this situation?
Yes, I think the government can do more to provide information. And that I was speaking to government earlier today, and they said that they are tightening up their laws so to properly regulate these microfinancing companies, and I think that is to be encouraged. But I think it's more to do with also the banking sector, the financial sector have to do a lot more to I think self-regulate themselves as well.
How long do you think Sri Lanka needs to take appropriate measures to address this situation? How long would you give them ideally?
Well, as soon as possible, really. I mean, again, women, particularly women, are being affected. Again, that forces them to engage in dangerous work, including sex work. And I've also heard cases of suicide among women, which is very unfortunate. So the government should take action now.
Another issue which is plaguing Sri Lanka is child labor. You said that it has aggravated because of COVID-19. Can you just paint us a picture on what child labor looks like in Sri Lanka?
Well, different sectors. I mean, I've heard of cases of some children working in the plantation sectors, and domestic work is another, and also so-called hospitality, like working in the shops and hotels. And I've heard also unfortunate incidents of children being sexually exploited in a tourism industry. Now, I think as the tourism recover from COVID, I think the instances of child sexual exploitation is going to increase among the foreign nationals coming in, and also perhaps there's also domestic element of that.
We see that there are authorities in Sri Lanka, like the National Child Protection Authority. We do have authorities that cater to the needs and welfare of children. What can they do to ensure that children are protected?
I think, again, I haven't had a chance to speak to that agency, so I cannot make assumptions or anything like that. But I think they are already working with, for example, local communities, school teachers, and so on. But I think more like early warning system. If that spreads across the whole country, I think that is to be commended. I'm sure that may happen in Colombo and more developed areas, but other areas it may not necessarily be the case. So my recommendation is for them to again implement that as soon as that early warning and stakeholder task force.
How important would it be for Sri Lanka to raise the minimum working age up to 18, given the fact that children do have the option of studying up to 18 years in Sri Lankan schools?
I would very much welcome that. Obviously, not all instances of child labour is exploitative. Some children may work for their parents if they have a shop or something like that. So within reasons, I don't see any issues, because in many countries, child can work from 15, for example, sometimes 14. As long as the nature of the work is not exploitative, I don't see why not. But there has to be a tighter control, making sure that the child is not working longer than necessary. They're not engaged in dangerous and hazardous work. So one of the things the government has done is to update this list of hazardous work. And I think that has been published in November, just a couple of weeks ago, in the official gazette. So that includes that list of hazardous work, including something like domestic work. So under that, then these children cannot work in this type of work until they are 18. So I think there's that basis. That list has about 71 professions, apparently. So I think that's a good starting point. But whether they should raise to 18, sometimes it may be desirable, depending on the nature of the work. But for others, something like helping their parents, that may not be as bad as. So I'm not here to comment on whether they should prohibit, or work under the age of 18. But again, more protection that they can give, the better. So if they allow work at 16, make sure that they have a proper regulation, monitoring mechanisms in place so that children are not exploited.
In your findings, you also pointed out that trade unions, certain trade unions are being suppressed, and there is shrinking space for civil society groups as well. What do you think the government needs to do at this point of time in terms of ensuring this democratic right to exercise the freedom of speech and the freedom to protest? Because very recently, we have seen human rights activists raising concerns on forced quarantine of protesters and the government using COVID-19 pandemic as a guise to suppress protests. What are your thoughts on that?
I've also heard that, unfortunately, and if that's being done on purpose, then I think there's a serious issue there, and I certainly would be expressing my concern. And I think civic space must be protected, and they are there to advance human rights, workers' rights, and so on. They should be able to work freely without any interference, and I think that's quite important. So the government, I know that the government works in different sectors, and I think they are also taking steps to address these issues, which is to be recommended, but I think there's a scope to do more and create a space. So one of the things they can do in my own area is to have a more clearly established multi-stakeholder forum where governments and civil society, trade union, and workers can sit down and discuss important issues and making a collective decision. I think that may be a good starting point. Something like that can also build trust among different actors. One of the unfortunate situations is that not just in Sri Lanka but in elsewhere, that trust isn't there. So that's why they have an antagonistic relationship. But it doesn't have to be that way. As long as the government is open to invite them to the table, let's discuss it, and let's make a collective decision. And I hope, if Sri Lanka can take a lead in it, and again, other countries can learn from Sri Lanka, so it can be that this country can be a leader in that type of a development.
I'm sure you would have visited the hill country in Sri Lanka, where estate is the main livelihood. What are the main issues you have identified there? How are the living conditions like, and what can Sri Lanka do to improve it?
Sure. One of the key issues there is a gender dimension. So the women oftentimes women have to work twice as long to earn the same amount of money at, say, 1,000 rupees, and they have to pluck teas, and there's a daily kind of target. If they don't achieve that, they may not necessarily get the full amount, and I think there's an element of discrimination. And as you say, living condition is there's, again, the government has to act now. I've seen them at line houses. I visited them, and I've seen an appalling conditions of these living conditions, and tiny space shared by 5, 6, 7 families. It often extended. It's the children, parents, and their parents, and I think it's very. No, it is. There's much scope. Countries like India has been helping to build houses in conjunction with Sri Lanka, but that needs to happen a lot faster. Some of them have been able to benefit from these new developments, but the vast majority of them have not been, and there is an issue in that. So I'll be pressing the government to do more in this regard.
Right. Taking all these issues into account, let me finally ask you, Mr. Tomoya, what do you make up of Sri Lanka's labor laws? Do you think that it is outdated? Do you think Sri Lanka can make changes? What are your thoughts?
Sri Lanka can make changes, and as I said, I've been encouraged by some of the recent development where they are modifying laws and so on. In, for example, regulating microfinancing, trying to regulate the activities of like sub-agents for migration for employment and so on. So now I think government is taking steps, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But there are certain statutes, laws, as you said, maybe slightly, are quite outdated. And again, it is for the government to regularly update in line with the current conditions, and I think that's important. And as I understand it, there are so many laws in this area as well, and so there is also scope to streamline, consolidate, making it simpler for everyone to understand and enforce. I think that's important as well.